History of England, Chapter 11, Part 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Kara Schallenberg. History of England from the Accession of James II by Thomas Babington Macaulay, Chapter 11, Part 4. Some weeks elapsed before all the arrangements which have been mentioned were publicly announced, and meanwhile many important events had taken place. As soon as the new privy councillors had been sworn in, it was necessary to submit to them a grave and pressing question. Could the Convention now assembled be turned into a Parliament? The Whigs, who had a decided majority in the Lower House, were all for the affirmative. The Tories, who knew that within the last month the public feeling had undergone a considerable change, and who hoped that a general election would add to their strength, were for the negative. They maintained that to the existence of a Parliament royal writs were indispensably necessary. The Convention had not been summoned by such writs. The original defect could not now be supplied. The Houses were therefore mere clubs of private men, and ought instantly to disperse. It was answered that the royal writ was mere matter of form, and that to expose the substance of our laws and liberties to serious hazard for the sake of a form would be the most senseless superstition. Wherever the sovereign, the peers spiritual and temporal, and the representatives freely chosen by the constituent bodies of the realm were met together, there was the essence of a Parliament. Such a Parliament was now in being, and what could be more absurd than to dissolve it at a conjuncture when every hour was precious, when numerous important subjects required immediate legislation, and when dangers, only to be averted by the combined efforts of King, Lords, and Commons, menaced the state. A Jacobite indeed might consistently refuse to recognize the Convention as a Parliament, for he held that it had from the beginning been an unlawful assembly, that all its resolutions were nullities, and that the sovereigns whom it had set up were usurpers. But with what consistency could any man, who maintained that a new Parliament ought to be immediately called by writs under the great seal of William and Mary, question the authority which had placed William and Mary on the throne? Those who held that William was rightful king must necessarily hold that the body from which he derived his right was itself a rightful great council of the realm. Those who, though not holding him to be rightful king, conceived that they might lawfully swear allegiance to him as king in fact, might surely on the same principle acknowledge the Convention as a Parliament in fact. It was plain that the Convention was the fountainhead from which the authority of all future Parliaments must be derived, and that on the validity of the votes of the Convention must depend the validity of every future statute. And how could the stream rise higher than the source? Was it not absurd to say that the Convention was supreme in the state, and yet a nullity? A legislature for the highest of all purposes, and yet no legislature for the humblest purposes, competent to declare the throne vacant, to change the succession, to fix the landmarks of the Constitution, and yet not competent to pass the most trivial act for the repairing of a pier or the building of a parish church. These arguments would have had considerable weight, even if every precedent had been on the other side. But in truth our history afforded only one precedent which was at all in point, and that precedent was decisive in favour of the doctrine that royal writs are not indispensably necessary to the existence of a Parliament. No royal writ had summoned the Convention which recalled Charles II. Yet that Convention had, after his restoration, continued to sit and to legislate, had settled the revenue, had passed an act of amnesty, had abolished the feudal tenures. These proceedings had been sanctioned by authority of which no party in the state could speak without reverence. Hale had borne a considerable share in them, and had always maintained that they were strictly legal. Clarendon, little as he was inclined to favour any doctrine derogatory to the rights of the crown, or to the dignity of that seal of which he was keeper, had declared that, since God had, at a most critical conjuncture, given the nation a good Parliament, it would be the height of folly to look for technical flaws in the instrument by which that Parliament was called together. Would it be pretended by any Tory that the Convention of 1660 had a more respectable origin than the Convention of 1689? Was not a letter written by the first prince of the blood, at the request of the whole peerage, and of hundreds of gentlemen who had represented counties and towns, at least as good a warrant as a vote of the Rump? Weaker reasons than these would have satisfied the Whigs who formed the majority of the Privy Council. The King, therefore, on the 5th day after he had been proclaimed, went with royal state to the House of Lords, and took his seat on the throne. The Commons were called in, and he, with many gracious expressions, reminded his hearers of the perilous situation of the country, and exhorted them to take such steps as might prevent unnecessary delay in the transaction of public business. His speech was received by the gentlemen who crowded the bar with the deep hum by which our ancestors were wont to indicate approbation, and which was often heard in places more sacred than the chamber of the peers. As soon as he had retired, a bill declaring the Convention a Parliament was laid on the table of the Lords, and rapidly passed by them. In the Commons the debates were warm. The House resolved itself into a committee, and so great was the excitement that, when the authority of the Speaker was withdrawn, it was hardly possible to preserve order. Sharp personalities were exchanged. The phrase, "Hear him," a phrase which had originally been used only to silence irregular noises, and to remind members of the duty of attending to the discussion, had, during some years, been gradually becoming what it is now, that is to say, a cry indicative, according to the tone, of admiration, acquiescence, indignation, or derision. On this occasion the Whigs vociferated "Hear, hear," so tumultuously that the Tories complained of unfair usage. Seymour, the leader of the minority, declared that there could be no freedom of debate while such clamour was tolerated. Some old Whig members were provoked into reminding him that the same clamour had occasionally been heard when he presided, and had not then been repressed. Yet, eager and angry as both sides were, the speeches on both sides indicated that profound reverence for law and prescription which has long been characteristic of Englishmen, and which, though it runs sometimes into pedantry and sometimes into superstition, is not without its advantages. Even at that momentous crisis, when the nation was still in the ferment of a revolution, our public men talked long and seriously about all the circumstances of the deposition of Edward the Second and of the deposition of Richard the Second, and anxiously inquired whether the assembly which, with Archbishop Lanfranc at its head, set aside Robert of Normandy and put William Rufus on the throne, did or did not afterwards continue to act as the legislature of the realm. Much was said about the history of writs, much about the etymology of the word Parliament. It is remarkable that the orator who took the most statesmanlike view of the subject was old Maynard. In the civil conflicts of 50 eventful years he had learned that questions affecting the highest interests of the Commonwealth were not to be decided by verbal cavils and by scraps of law French and law Latin, and being by universal acknowledgment the most subtle and the most learned of English jurists, he could express what he felt without the risk of being accused of ignorance and presumption. He scornfully thrust aside as frivolous and out of place all that black-letter learning which some men, far less versed in such matters than himself, had introduced into the discussion. "We are," he said, "at this moment out of the beaten path. If therefore we are determined to move only in that path, we cannot move at all. A man in a revolution resolving to do nothing which is not strictly according to established form, resembles a man who has lost himself in the wilderness, and who stands crying, 'Where is the King's highway? I will walk nowhere but on the King's highway.' In a wilderness a man should take the track which will carry him home. In a revolution we must have recourse to the highest law, the safety of the state. Another veteran Roundhead, Colonel Birch, took the same side, and argued with great force and keenness from the precedent of 1660. Seymour and his supporters were beaten in the committee, and did not venture to divide the House on the report. The bill passed rapidly, and received the royal assent on the 10th day after the accession of William and Mary. The law which turned the Convention into a Parliament contained a clause providing that no person should, after the 1st of March, sit or vote in either House without taking the oaths to the new King and Queen. This enactment produced great agitation throughout society. The adherents of the exiled dynasty hoped and confidently predicted that the recusants would be numerous. The minority in both Houses, it was said, would be true to the cause of hereditary monarchy. There might be here and there a traitor, but the great body of those who had voted for a regency would be firm. Only 2 bishops at most would recognize the usurpers. Seymour would retire from public life rather than abjure his principles. Grafton had determined to fly to France, and to throw himself at the feet of his uncle. With such rumours as these, all the coffee-houses of London were filled during the latter part of February. So intense was the public anxiety that, if any man of rank was missed, 2 days running, at his usual haunts, it was immediately whispered that he had stolen away to St. Germain's. The 2nd of March arrived, and the event quieted the fears of one party and confounded the hopes of the other. The Primate, indeed, and several of his suffragans stood obstinately aloof, but 3 bishops and 73 temporal peers took the oaths. At the next meeting of the Upper House several more prelates came in. Within a week about 100 lords had qualified themselves to sit. Others, who were prevented by illness from appearing, sent excuses and professions of attachment to their majesties. Grafton refuted all the stories which had been circulated about him by coming to be sworn on the first day. 2 members of the Ecclesiastical Commission, Mulgrave and Sprat, hastened to make atonement for their fault by plighting their faith to William. Beaufort, who had long been considered as the type of royalist of the old school, submitted after a very short hesitation. Aylesbury and Dartmouth, though vehement Jacobites, had as little scruple about taking the oath of allegiance as they afterwards had about breaking it. The Hydes took different paths. Rochester complied with the law, but Clarendon proved refractory. Many thought it strange that the brother who had adhered to James till James absconded should be less sturdy than the brother who had been in the Dutch camp. The explanation, perhaps, is that Rochester would have sacrificed much more than Clarendon by refusing to take the oaths. Clarendon's income did not depend on the pleasure of the government, but Rochester had a pension of 4,000 a year, which he could not hope to retain if he refused to acknowledge the new sovereigns. Indeed, he had so many enemies that, during some months, it seemed doubtful whether he would on any terms be suffered to retain the splendid reward which he had earned by persecuting the Whigs and by sitting in the High Commission. He was saved from what would have been a fatal blow to his fortunes by the intercession of Burnet, who had been deeply injured by him, and who revenged himself as became a Christian divine. In the Lower House 400 members were sworn in on the 2nd of March, and among them was Seymour. The spirit of the Jacobites was broken by his defection, and the minority, with very few exceptions, followed his example. Before the day fixed for the taking of the oaths, the Commons had begun to discuss a momentous question which admitted of no delay. During the interregnum, William had, as provisional chief of the administration, collected the taxes and applied them to the public service, nor could the propriety of this course be questioned by any person who approved of the Revolution. But the Revolution was now over. The vacancy of the throne had been supplied. The Houses were sitting. The law was in full force, and it became necessary immediately to decide to what revenue the government was entitled. Nobody denied that all the lands and hereditaments of the crown had passed with the crown to the new sovereigns. Nobody denied that all duties which had been granted to the crown for a fixed term of years might be constitutionally exacted till that term should expire. But large revenues had been settled by Parliament on James for life, and whether what had been settled on James for life could, while he lived, be claimed by William and Mary, was a question about which opinions were divided. Holt, Treby, Pollexfen, indeed all the eminent Whig lawyers, Somers excepted, held that these revenues had been granted to the late king, in his political capacity, but for his natural life, and ought therefore, as long as he continued to drag on his existence in a strange land, to be paid to William and Mary. It appears from a very concise and unconnected report of this debate that Somers dissented from this doctrine. His opinion was that, if the Act of Parliament which had imposed the duties in question was to be construed according to the spirit, the word life must be understood to mean reign, and that therefore the term for which the grant had been made had expired. This was surely the sound opinion, for it was plainly irrational to treat the interest of James in this grant as at once a thing annexed to his person and a thing annexed to his office, to say in one breath that the merchants of London and Bristol must pay money because he was naturally alive, and that his successors must receive that money because he was politically defunct. The House was decidedly with Somers. The members generally were bent on effecting a great reform, without which it was felt that the Declaration of Rights would be but an imperfect guarantee for public liberty. During the conflict which 15 successive Parliaments had maintained against 4 successive kings, the chief weapon of the Commons had been the power of the purse, and never had the representatives of the people been induced to surrender that weapon without having speedy cause to repent of their too credulous loyalty. In that season of tumultuous joy which followed the Restoration, a large revenue for life had been almost by acclamation granted to Charles II. A few months later there was scarcely a respectable Cavalier in the kingdom who did not own that the stewards of the nation would have acted more wisely if they had kept in their hands the means of checking the abuses which disgraced every department of the government. James II had obtained from his submissive Parliament, without a dissentient voice, an income sufficient to defray the ordinary expenses of the state during his life, and, before he had enjoyed that income half a year, the great majority of those who had dealt thus liberally with him blamed themselves severely for their liberality. If experience was to be trusted, a long and painful experience, there could be no effectual security against maladministration, unless the sovereign were under the necessity of recurring frequently to his great council for pecuniary aid. Almost all honest and enlightened men were therefore agreed in thinking that a part at least of the supplies ought to be granted only for short terms. And what time could be fitter for the introduction of this new practice than the year 1689, the commencement of a new reign, of a new dynasty, of a new era of constitutional government? The feeling on this subject was so strong and general that the dissentient minority gave way. No formal resolution was passed, but the House proceeded to act on the supposition that the grants which had been made to James for life had been annulled by his abdication. It was impossible to make a new settlement of the revenue without inquiry and deliberation. The Exchequer was ordered to furnish such returns as might enable the House to form estimates of the public expenditure and income. In the meantime, liberal provision was made for the immediate exigencies of the state. An extraordinary aid, to be raised by direct monthly assessment, was voted to the king. An act was passed indemnifying all who had, since his landing, collected by his authority the duties settled on James, and those duties which had expired were continued for some months. End of Chapter 11, Part 4. Read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org, on June 3, 2007, in Oceanside, California.